the UK net zero strategy is full of holes and far, far from what's needed to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. The IPCC have told us that we need rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. But do you see that sort of change going on if you look around you? I certainly don't. So hole number one, the net zero strategy is based on a CCC plan from 2019. Now, this plan made the peculiar assumption that all countries would cut emissions at the same pace as the UK. But that completely ignores the fact that many developing nations will see rising populations, and they will also see increased emissions as they climb out of poverty and people just have enough to eat and a proper roof over their heads. So it's just, apart from being unethical to assume that countries that have had very little part in causing this problem should cut as fast as us, and countries that often don't have the financial resources to do so, it's also mathematically illiterate to make that assumption. The other key point to pick up on this important clause from the Climate Change Committee's report is that they say their plans are based on a likelihood of a 50% chance of success. That's a 50% chance of success in avoiding something as serious as losing control of our climate for good. 50-50. Hole number two, the CCC plan rested on us making ambitious cuts in the near term, straight away, getting on with the low-hanging fruit. And that's because warming is proportional to the total amount of CO2 we put into the atmosphere. And because we're emitting at quite a high rate now, we need to get that down quickly so that we don't burn through our carbon budget too fast, and we can stretch out the ultimate decarbonisation date until several decades hence and buy ourselves time. But as the chair of the CCC has warned, we're seeing very little action and very little delivery. It's all promises. So we know we've got to move much faster now. The pathway that the UK is on at the moment looks more like this on the right. Very little action in the near term, with promises often based on absurd and unworkable assumptions for cuts later towards 2050. But cutting emissions to zero in 2050 is not the key thing here. It's about how much we emit along the way. And you can see in this scenario on the right, we will emit, the area under the curve, far more CO2, in this example around twice as much as the pathway that we've been advised to adopt. Hole number three, our plan ignores 40% of our carbon footprint. That's the emissions embodied in the goods we import and also international aviation and shipping, which are not included at the moment, but will be from 2033. But that's still a big emission. Politicians have congratulated themselves on the fact that we've reduced our territorial emissions, those within our geographical borders, by 46% since 1990. But that overlooks the fact that we have offshored so much of our manufacturing. Those emissions haven't gone away, we've simply moved them to a different territory. Now, this is a big issue for the UK because we're one of the world's largest net importers, the third biggest in the world, in fact, measured in terms of net imports of CO2 emissions. Now, the real cut, when you look at our entire footprint, is less than 18% over that whole period, that 30-year period. That's less than 1% a year, which is, you know, it's tiny incremental change. It's not what we need. Now, the UK is not doing anything different to other countries in the world here. It's the standard UN practice to account for emissions on a territorial basis, but this needs to change because we're ultimately the ones for making the buying decisions for those imported goods. So we need to take responsibility for those emissions. Companies and cities do it under a British standard, which explains how this works. Even the NHS does it. It's time for countries to make a change to consumption-based accounting. The consequence of these first three holes is that UK plans will have us emitting over 2.5 times our fair share of the carbon budget. Hole number 4, the UK's plans depend on a large amount of CO2 being extracted from the air with technology over the next 20, 30 years. The first of these technologies I want to talk about is BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. Now, this is all about Drax Power Station in North Yorkshire, which produces electricity by burning wood chip. There are also plans to use a similar process to make hydrogen. All, in the government strategy, they want to scale up Drax to about 2.5 times capacity, presumably with new plants. But Drax already uses over 50% of the entire world wood pellet supply. So immediately, this looks ludicrous. Even expecting that Drax can continue to operate is madness. It's naive to think that the US, where Drax obtains most of its wood pellets, will allow them to continue chopping their forests down. And there are some campaigns gaining ground in the US who are really raising awareness of this, focusing on environmental breaches of air pollution by Drax in their wood pelleting plants, etc. The fundamental idea of BECCS is problematic because you're competing with nature just at a time when we realize we've got to do something to restore our depleted natural world. We're chopping down forests and replacing them with plantations is absolutely the opposite direction from the one we should be taking. We also need to reserve agricultural land in this country for food security, because warmer countries are going to be facing reduced crop yields over the next few decades as climate change takes hold. Water is also going to become scarcer. There'll be more droughts. So chopping forests down and then having tree plantations which need watering, again, doesn't make sense. The costs are enormous to the taxpayer. Think tank Ember has estimated them at 32 billion and that's just for Drax alone, not for the 2.5 times worth of Drax that we're looking at in the plans. That's to contribute towards the construction of all the carbon capture equipment, but also to support the operation of Drax, to support them being able to sell electricity into the grid when they're making it at such a high price, because this is not a cheap way to make electricity. It's much more expensive than renewables. The plans for Drax depend on capturing the carbon that's emitted in the process, the carbon dioxide, and pumping it underground. But carbon capture has been attempted for decades, particularly in the US, where they've spent billions on it, but they've abandoned almost all of the projects. One of the only operational examples is a case where they use CO2 to pump into oil wells to extract more oil. So it's not a great example of a process that's supposed to be carbon neutral. And then this idea that BECCS is carbon negative has been seriously called into question by numerous studies. If we think about the process, the claim is that the burning wood pellets for electricity is carbon neutral, and then if you capture that CO2, it becomes carbon negative. But it just isn't carbon neutral, self-evidently, because when you're chopping down forests, which are continually absorbing carbon, and you're in their place, you're leaving empty ground, that carbon that they were absorbing is no longer absorbed, and that allows atmospheric CO2 levels to rise. At the same time, the exposed ground is now no longer protected by trees and leaf litter, and it loses carbon. The trees that are planted on that bare ground don't start to absorb any sort of meaningful levels of carbon for 15, 20, 30 years until they're big enough to do so. So over the period of deep concern for the climate, over the next 20 years, when we really mustn't risk crossing dangerous tipping points, we're actually in a sort of carbon debt where we've emitted all this carbon and the promise of sucking it back out of the air hasn't kicked in yet because the trees aren't big enough. So the whole thing's flawed. The other key technology is direct air capture with carbon storage. So here is the first operational plant in Iceland called Orca. It'll capture 4,000 tons a year. But the UK has recently uprated its ambitions for DAX from 5 million tons a year in 2050 up to 29 million tons in 2050. Now that implies 7,250 Orca plants just in the UK, which would mean 5 being built every week between now and 2050 at a huge capital cost. You're looking at around 60 billion based on the cost of Orca. But then you have to add on top of that the running costs. There is no saleable product from this. You're simply sucking CO2 out of the air and pumping it underground and bonding it into rock in a very high energy process. So that's expensive to run, and the taxpayer are going to have to pay all those running costs, which will be huge and permanently ongoing. But then we come to, I think, the fundamental killer argument here, and that is that because this is a high energy process, it's going to need, it needs powering anyway by electricity, but we won't have any surplus renewable capacity because we have an enormous challenge already in building up our grid to 2 or 3 times its current size to allow for decarbonisation of homes, the electrification of home heating, and the electrification of transport. Adding plants like this on top is simply going to cause the cycling on of gas power stations. So what we suck from the atmosphere with one hand, we're putting back with the other. It's absolute madness to think that this is the solution. But although it's not the solution for the immediate crisis, DAX may very well be a useful technology to us in the future. Once renewable capacity catches up with demand, and that could be, who knows, 2050, 2060, maybe beyond, we could use surplus clean electricity to drive DAX plants, using them to lower atmospheric CO2 back down to safer historical levels. So how could we have got into this position? Well, governments just have not wanted to level with the public. They haven't wanted to grasp the nettle on this. And it's been very convenient to latch on to the idea of these fabulous technologies that are going to solve all our problems. We've also seen with the COVID fast lane culture how governments can be swayed into taking decisions that aren't necessarily in the national interest by big business. We've even got ExxonMobil sitting on the government's Carbon Capture and Storage Committee. Now, that can't be right. And Drax sat on the Climate Change Committee until the middle of last year, when that hit the press and the particular executive had to resign. And at some point, people are going to realize that this isn't going to work. But then it's too late for Plan B, because Plan B is to cut emissions now. Hundreds of billions are going to be spent on this negative emissions technology. We could spend that instead on reducing emissions now, on decarbonising homes, on building a world-class public transport system, bringing huge levelling up benefits. But it does mean putting ourselves on an emergency footing and being frank with the public. So a couple more technologies where some myths need busting. Firstly, hydrogen. There's been a major push by the fracking lobby to use hydrogen for home heating, despite numerous studies that show this is not the right way to go. The idea would be to use blue hydrogen, which means hydrogen produced from methane, but where you capture the CO2 and put it underground and supposedly make the process carbon neutral. The problem is, this process just isn't carbon neutral, and that's because all methane extraction operations suffer from leakages. These fugitive emissions are estimated at least 1%, and in this latest study, over 3% there. Now, why does that matter? It matters because methane is 84 times more potent a warming gas than CO2. So you only need just over 1% of leaked methane for that methane to have as much impact, once you times it by 84, as burning all the gas in the traditional way. But of course, once you get up to 3.7% leakage multiplied by 84 times, you're having many times the warming impact from just that leak methane, even if you capture all the CO2. And that's why studies are now suggesting that this process could actually be worse than burning coal. We then get on to just simple economics, that using blue hydrogen is twice as costly as heating homes just with electric heat pumps, and it causes dangerous air pollution. We know that burning hydrogen in oxygen just makes water, but when you burn it in air with all the impurities in air, it creates a pollutant called NOx, and that is extremely bad for health. And a DEFRA study have shown that the NOx pollution from hydrogen boilers will actually be worse than that seen from gas boilers. So hydrogen for home heating is a no-no. We do need hydrogen for certain sectors, for heavy industry, for steel, brick, tile manufacture, and perhaps for shipping, where electrification isn't really an option. Unfortunately, it is possible to make hydrogen in a green way, green hydrogen, electrolyzed from water using renewable electricity. But going back to the point that we don't have spare renewable capacity, we need to limit that to just where it's needed. And it certainly is not viable to be using hydrogen for homes or car transport. Sustainable aviation fuels. This is a clear nonsense. We have competition for land already with food security issues, the desire to use wood for construction, and BECCS itself. And even if we pull that away, there's not the land to be dedicating to making aviation fuels. In the future, it would be nice to think that we will expand our renewable capacity, perhaps with huge solar arrays in the desert, to make green hydrogen for aviation. But there's no immediate solution for aviation fuels. And any talk of sustainable aviation fuels in the next coming decades is nonsense. Cakeism, the tendency of governments to tell the public that they can have their cake and eat it. Now, we know that our electricity grid needs to increase significantly to electrify homes and to electrify transport. And in fact, the new 40 gigawatts of wind that has been pledged equates to only about half of our current grid. And if you think we're going to have to triple that grid, then we're going to need 6 times that amount. So this is just not enough. And it's a huge challenge to increase the grid by that to that extent. And it's going to take decades. So in the meantime, we've got to stop this waste of energy that we currently accept, through our leaky homes and our huge cars and unnecessary car journeys. And this is where the net zero strategy is just, it does nothing to tackle demand at all. There's virtually no funding for insulation. The heat pump grant is so inadequately funded that it would take around 1,000 years to decarbonize our homes. There are no measures to reduce car journeys, and in fact, there's big funding for building more roads, which will increase journeys. There's nothing to reduce flights, and in fact, there's an encouragement to increase the number of domestic flights. And there's no action on diet or anything to electrify rail. And then a brief mention of offsetting. The UK is planning to offset its aviation emissions internationally through this ludicrous scheme against the advice of the CCC. Now, when you consider that the world is so very far behind where it needs to be in its mitigation efforts to avoid exceeding 1.5 degrees, the idea that we can identify an improvement in mitigation somewhere else in the world and say, okay, that allows us to emit more through our aviation is just madness. We need to bank any of these gains made to get nearer to 1.5, not blow them with more emissions through aviation. And then just a quick summing up in this graphic, we've got funding that's too low relatively. Yes, these are big numbers, but in terms of heading off the enormous costs of uncontrolled climate change. They are not big numbers. We're not funding mitigation enough, so we've got a very gentle curve in the near term. We're promising huge amounts of taxpayer support to a small number of companies to implement technologies that have been widely discredited. Instead, we could spend that money now and bring this curve down faster, and we won't need these negative emission technologies. At the same time, government is spending our hard-earned tax revenue on projects that worsen climate change. You know, I mentioned road building. We've also got HS2 with a huge amount of concrete and associated emissions involved, and the chopping down of forests. And we've also got this criminal funding of North Sea oil and gas, £12 billion every year, just to make climate change worse and make our whole decarbonisation project even more difficult to achieve. And added to that, you've got 23 billion, a 23 billion estimate for the support the government's going to give to help oil companies decommission their North Sea oil and gas rigs. Now, that's got to be wrong. The oil companies have broken any sort of social contract they had, if they did ever have one, by lying and trying to discredit the science over many years. They should not be receiving support for decommissioning old rigs. So it's very simple. We need to fund the reduction in emissions now, in the near term. That's what we've been told to do. We need to stop making our plans all about promises for tomorrow, and we need to spread funding out widely amongst the public, like we did with COVID, so that people can afford the changes needed to decarbonise.